Welcome into Rush Hour, presented by Bet Rivers. I'm Danny Burke, your host, here with VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Of course, you can follow VSiN on Twitter at VSiN Live, and myself, Danny Burke, at Danny Burke5 on the tweets. You can follow our next guest on Twitter at Whalen, except instead of the L, it's the one in the handle. RotoWire NBA editor Nick Whalen joining us. Nick, the NBA season's almost upon us. It's been a while since we talked. How have you been, man?
I've been great. Yeah, I think it's been since early in the NBA Finals since we've talked. So, I mean, not as long as maybe it normally would be given this short off season, but so excited. We've had preseason back this past weekend throughout this week, and then we're less than a week away now until opening night.
It might be hard to speculate as at this point, but since everything is kind of altered in terms of the start date and how things are really just going to be shaking out, I mean, I know it's early with what you've seen for preseason, or maybe what you could assume. What do you think the differences are going to be this year, even just from an overall playing standpoint with these teams and these players? But more importantly, how about a handicapping standpoint? Is that going to be altered completely because of how different everything is this year, do you think?
Yeah, it's so tough to say. I think the last few weeks coming into training camp, it seemed like it would maybe be a little bit more severe than it actually might be in terms of players resting. The NBA issued a pretty stern memo update last week, kind of reminding teams that even in a pandemic shortened season, even with 72 games, with more back-to-backs, with fewer off days, we still don't want you resting guys on national TV. We still don't want you resting guys on the road. We don't want you resting star players in the same game. And when you start to look at some of the marquee teams in the league that play, 40% of their games on national TV, all of a sudden it's kind of hard to find rest days for guys like LeBron and Anthony Davis and Jimmy Butler and Kawhi Leonard. So, from a rest aspect, I don't know that it's going to be quite as severe as a lot of people think. I don't think every star is just going to be penciled in for 15, rest nights throughout the season. From a gambling standpoint, the odds for opening night as well as Christmas Day in a few games on December 23rd are up. I'm a little bit surprised that we do seem to see a little bit of a bump for the home teams, at least a little bit more than I would expect. For example, Milwaukee's only a 3-point favorite in Boston. Brooklyn getting 5.5 on opening night against Golden State. I don't hate either of those lines. I don't think they're outlandish, but I also wonder how much home court advantage we're going to see this year when you don't have fans in the stands, when travel isn't quite as much of an issue as it normally would be. As I'm sure you're aware, in the NFL, it's kind of been night and day compared to a normal season. So I think it's going to be interesting to note, whether road teams in the NBA begin to have more success than in years past as well.
Yeah, it certainly will. It's going to be fascinating to see how that unfolds and plays a factor in the long term when it comes to how these players are really just affected by it and how that can really just change the game in terms of the betting landscape. And, of course, we'll hit on that with you continuously throughout the season. But before we really kind of take a look at the individual games, which we'll probably do in the coming weeks or obviously before the season starts, I wanted to go more long term with you and just look at these futures with MVPs, division winners, season win totals to make the playoffs, all that good stuff. So with that being said, I want to start off with MVP winner for you. And I guess it's not too surprising who's at the top of the list, but we got Luka Doncic at the number one spot, plus 400 currently at Bet Rivers, the odds-on favorite to win MVP. Then you got Giannis, who signed his big contract. He's at plus 450. Stephen Curry at 8-1. LeBron 9-1, along with Anthony Davis. KD coming back from the injury at 12-1. Tatum and Lillard at 16-1, and the list kind of just goes on. But out of that group of players, I mean, who's probably your number one guy? And if it's more the chalkier selection, then who would maybe be a dark horse in your mind?
Well, I mean, MVP is usually a pretty chalky award. There's not a lot of guys that come out of nowhere or even come out of below the top 5 or 6 guys in terms of the preseason odds to win the MVP. It's usually a front runner type of award. So I agree with the odds makers. I think I would go with Luka Doncic. I think he's the safest bet. It's kind of feeling like, LeBron James, 3rd, 4th, 5th years in Cleveland already for Doncic, where you kind of feel like it's going to be his league and eventually he's going to be rewarded for that. The question is, can he play enough games? He's a guy who's been banged up, had a lot of ankle issues over the last couple of seasons. But I feel like if he is able to stay relatively healthy, he kind of has the narrative going into the season after how well he finished last year. It's going to be tough to give it to Giannis 3 years in a row, especially after the Bucks flame out last season. So Doncic, would be my pick among the favorites. If you want to go a little bit deeper, you know what? I do like Kevin Durant at 12 to 1. And I
Hmm.
think that number was as high as 18 or 19 to 1 in some books over the last couple of weeks. And I think it was kind of a relief for some people to see him play the other night and see how great he looked. So I'm not surprised that that's moved a little bit lower. You want to talk about narrative. I think if Kevin Durant is able to stay healthy, looks basically like vintage Kevin Durant throughout the season, the Nets are a top 3 or 4 seed in the Eastern Conference. I think there's a pretty strong narrative that could develop behind Durant coming back from the injury, missing all of last season, joining a new team, having a completely new coaching staff. It can almost double as a comeback player of the year / MVP type of award. So I like Durant quite a bit at 12 to 1. I don't think this is a LeBron MVP year. I think he's pushed pretty hard for it the last couple of seasons. He came up short each of those years. And I think his focus is probably firmly shifted back to winning titles. So I would kind of cross off LeBron at 9 to 1. Lillard at 16 to 1 is pretty interesting. I think he's always kind of been 1 or 2 steps below, true MVP caliber players in the NBA. Not a guy that you really hear as a serious MVP contender, but these last couple of years, he's crept into that conversation year in and year out. And you want to talk about a guy who you really don't have any concerns about durability wise, sitting out games wise. He's at the top of that list. So if you are someone that fears that some of these older stars, might miss more games than normal during this pandemic season, that's not really a concern with Lillard. And I think the Blazers will be a much better team this year as well. So they're not going to be fighting for that 8-9 spot as they were last year. If they're a surprise team and Damian Lillard is averaging close to 30 points per game again next season, I think his name's going to be right there in the mix.
Yep, completely agree with you. I'm so glad you brought up both of those players because that's who I was going to ask you about next. Kevin Durant with his narrative at 12 to 1, better odds than you would typically see for KD with any MVP odds. And then Damian Lillard, who was having a great season before everything came to a halt and then still continued it with the return in Orlando. So I like both of those selections. And of course, Doncic is the favorite, another one you pointed out as well. Moving on from the MVP discussion now. Obviously, a lot of these books offer it. Bet Rivers does a really great job of doing it as well. You can bet the division winners for the NBA, and, a lot of them are skewed to the favorite being, and I got to ask you about it, the Central Division, because that's our area right here in the Midwest, but the Bucks are obviously a huge favorite, minus 5,000. The Pacers, 12 to 1, Bulls, 50 to 1, Pistons and Cavs, 150 to 1. So I guess more so because we know what we can expect from the Bucks, but more importantly, what do you expect out of the Pacers and the Bulls, I guess, is my question to you for this year.
I regret to inform you that I cannot advise you to place money on the Chicago Bulls winning the Central Division this year. If that's why you brought me on, maybe I should head out. But no, it's Milwaukee's division. I think we all know that. If you're betting on Indiana or you're betting on Chicago, you're either betting on something catastrophic happening in Milwaukee, aka an injury to Giannis Antetokounmpo, or you're betting on one of those teams being, way better than we expect, and then probably a decline from Milwaukee, which has, locked up this division with basically a month to play each of these last 2 years. I think Milwaukee has not looked great early in the preseason. It's been a little clunky. They're replacing, a ton of guys who were kind of like the 5 through 10 in their rotation. So there might be some bumps along the road for them during the regular season. But, as long as Giannis is healthy, as long as Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton are relatively healthy, they're the overwhelming favorite for a reason. So I really can't tell you to bet anybody but Milwaukee in the Central. Chicago at 50 to 1 is appealing, but I still think they're probably a year or two away from really being in that conversation.
All right, how about the Atlantic Division? The Nets, the favorite, plus 125. Celtics, plus 250. Raptors, plus 320. Then you get Philadelphia at 4 to 1 and the lowly Knicks at 250 to 1. Who you like in that division?
Yeah, the Atlantic has very quietly become, I think, hands down the best division, certainly in the Eastern Conference and maybe in the league. I mean, you have 4 legitimate, really good teams. And then, of course, the New York Knickerbockers at the bottom. This one's tough. I really am high on Brooklyn. I'm a big KD guy. I think he's going to remind people, why he's one of the 3 or 4 players in the NBA that you can throw on any team, and they're basically going to be a threat to win 50 games and go to the finals every year. So I'm not going to tell you to bet against Brooklyn. The odds for Philly are appealing, though. Getting the Sixers at 4 to 1, a team that it felt like really everything went wrong for them last season. The roster never really fit. And instead of running it back or instead of, just making a coaching change, they kind of opted to change everything. They kept that front office in place, added Daryl Morey, switch coaches, and then got rid of the guys who weren't fitting in. So, I think the Sixers almost by default will be better than last year. I think they had some bad health breaks at the end of last season as well. That painted that season maybe a little bit more negatively than it actually was. They were a terrible road team last season, one of the worst road teams in the league, just a crazy home road split. I think we'll see that gap narrow this year. So I would pick Brooklyn straight up to win the division, but in terms of value, I think I would lean towards Philly at 4-1.
All right, and then the other division I'll ask you about before we get to these win totals and odds to reach the playoffs. How about the Pacific Division? Lakers, the favorite, -143. Then you get the Clippers at about +120. Warriors at 18-1. The Suns, who had a nice return over the summer, 25-1. Kings, 100-1. Any value maybe with the Warriors or the Suns here, or is it just going to be head-to-head with the LA teams?
Man, if only one of the LA teams were in this division, I would say maybe there's some value there, because it's kind of like the Milwaukee bet where you're just betting that something goes wrong with that dominant team ahead of you. I don't think there's a route in which the Lakers stay completely healthy and finish with a worse record than the Suns. That just really doesn't compute. But there's a path to maybe LeBron James missing 20 games or Anthony Davis, tweaking an ankle, whatever it might be. The problem is then you have that other LA team that should be pretty dominant in the regular season as well. So, I think the Suns, there are other ways to bet them this season that I like, but winning the division, I think is probably a little bit too lofty for them. That they'll certainly be improved, but asking them to finish ahead of not only both LA teams, but the Warriors as well is probably a little bit too high. And, I hate to say it, but I kind of feel the same way about Golden State. Their starting five is really robust. I think they did a good job post Klay Thompson of kind of scrambling and grabbing Kelly Oubre and making that unit the best it can be. But, you're relying on a rookie in James Wiseman, who basically has to give you great minutes right away for you to be as successful as you want to be. And then the big issue is the bench. I mean, Golden State's bench has been, cleaned out the last couple of years with a lot of the guys like Barbosa and Livingston and Bogut, moving on and retiring. Iguodala, of course. It's essentially a lot of guys who are borderline G League players who are going to be asked to play major roles for this team this season. So, I think the Warriors are still a playoff team. They'll be a lot of fun, but their regular season ceiling to me is not higher than either of the LA teams.
All right, so we got about a few minutes left or so here, so I want to do some rapid fire with those odds to make the playoffs and the season win total. So, like you alluded to, the Warriors, their odds to make the playoffs, the yes is the favorite, -162, the no +132. Their win total, 54.5. The over is even money, under -122. So when you're putting it at exact numbers, where do you see the Warriors in terms of the wins, and do they reach the postseason?
Yeah, they're such a tough team to figure out. I can't bet against the healthy Steph Curry, though. I think they do make the postseason, and there's a little bit of value there. You're a lot of these other better teams in the Western Conference. There's not a lot of sense in betting yes based on some of those numbers, but this one's pretty close. And I think more than anything, it reflects the depth of the Western Conference. I just talked about how much I like the Warriors starting five. I think it's one of the better in the conference, but they're going to have some major issues in the event that Steph Curry, rolls an ankle, or Draymond Green or Kelly Oubre even miss time. If you could guarantee me that they stay healthy, I would say they're a lock to make the playoffs. But, given some of the health concerns of virtually every player on that roster besides Wiggins, I'm a little bit trepidatious, but I would still pick the Warriors as yes to make the playoffs out west.
Okay, then the Mavericks to make the playoffs, obviously a big favorite here. Yes, -215, no +485. Their win total, 57.5, shaded a little bit to the over. How do we feel about the Mavericks this year?
I mean, Dallas, I think, is that the win total or the win percentage? If that's the total, that's very high in a 72-game season. But either way, I think playoffs-wise for Dallas, I would bet the yes on that. You're not getting great value. But I think, as I said at the top, when we were talking about Luka Doncic as it relates to MVP, he's a one-man offense at this point. He guarantees you a top 3 offense in the NBA, if not the best offense ever, as they were for much of last season. So as long as you have Luka Doncic on your team, I think you're a virtual lock to make the playoffs. I'm not saying go throw $100,000 on that yes right now, but I think you're getting pretty good value for a team that I see very firmly in that playoff field next season.
All right, how about another squad to reach the playoffs? Do the Grizzlies get in that spot, one of the 8 seeds? The yes +180 if you believe so, the no -225.
I think that number's been on the move a little bit. I liked it a bit more a few days ago when it was kind of closer to 50-50, but I think the Grizzlies are out this year. I think Ja Morant is going to have an awesome follow-up to his rookie year. He's looked great in the preseason so far, but they're without Jaren Jackson to begin the year. That situation doesn't seem great. They don't really have a target date for when he'll be back. And when you're talking about a condensed season where you're playing, 4 games almost every week, if he misses 3 weeks, that could be upwards of 12 games, which is a large chunk of the season. So that's a big concern. And the other thing with Memphis is they really didn't change anything with that roster. And it was a fine roster last year, but I think they mostly overachieved. I think they got more out of Morant, more out of guys like Brandon Clark than they probably thought they would. Their big quote unquote addition, that you're hoping to get something from is Justice Winslow. He's also on the shelf to begin the year, hasn't been able to stay healthy at all. I don't think Memphis, the team takes a step back. I think other teams that were below them last season took a step forward, and Memphis kind of just stayed put.
Nick, as always, we appreciate your time. Thanks for the insight. We look forward to talking NBA with you throughout the whole season, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Danny.
All right, there he is, senior NBA editor over at RotoWire. By the way, those were win percentages instead of totals. Either way, great insight from our friend Nick. Love talking hoops with him. We'll talk a little bit more hoops next segment, college basketball and some Danny's Dimes next here on VSiN.